It's Zach Williams, the Old Church Choir. You're on Vision Christian Radio. Neil Johnson with you. It is the Tuesday edition of 2020, and a conversation coming over this next hour you might want to join into. It might be one of those times you get to ask the question you've always wanted to ask around the creation and evolution debate. Well, we're back to creation versus evolution today, especially around what we've all come to know as natural selection. It's one of the foundations of the argument for biological evolution. Natural selection relates to the struggle for existence, survival and reproduction, and those organisms that best adapt to their environment produce more descendants, in a constant competition where only the fittest survive and the weak face extinction. But our special guest today is turning the concept of natural selection on its head. She's well qualified to argue that natural selection is not evolution, but is actually supported biblically and scientifically as a God-ordained process that allows organisms to survive. Former biology professor Dr. Georgia Purdom is a molecular geneticist, a science educator, and author of the book called Galapagos Islands, A Different View. Her speciality is cellular and molecular biology. She is Vice President of Educational Content and actively speaks and writes for Answers in Genesis. Dr. Purdom was a designer of the Natural Selection is Not Evolution exhibit at the Creation Museum that was founded by Australian creationist Ken Ham in the United States. And Dr. Georgia Purdom is joining us from the United States. Georgia, a special welcome along.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Georgia, let's get a little geography here, because the Ark Encounter and the Creation Museum, they are there in northern Kentucky, which is so close to the border of Ohio and the city of Cincinnati. And when I asked you, where are you speaking to us from, you said Indiana. And that's also very much close there on the way that the states in the US there hold together in your neck of the woods. Give us a little idea of, home for you is in Indiana.
Yeah, so it's actually called the tri-state area. So we have an interstate called 275, and so I take that from my home in Indiana over here to Kentucky. But if I would drive north on it, I would be in Ohio. So I could actually pass through all three states, and probably in a matter of about 15 minutes.
Do they have any time zone issues? Is there any daylight savings times? They're all in the same time zone?
All on the same time zone, thank goodness.
What a relief. Hey, Georgia, with your expertise, when I say natural selection, so many listeners will be thinking back to their high school biology classes and the sorts of things that we learned as foundations for evolution as a way of looking at humanity. When you look at that word, natural selection, what does it say to you?
Well, you're correct that it's often equivocated with evolution. They're kind of those terms are used synonymously. But when you really examine natural selection and what it does, you see that it's very different from evolution. Because one really good example of that is, natural selection is something that we can observe in the present, whereas evolution is something that happens over eons of time and has really kind of happened in the past. It happens over long periods of unobservable time. And so right there tells you that they're two extremely different things. Natural selection allows organisms to be able to sort of adapt and live better in the environments that they're in, whereas evolution requires a change from one kind of organism to another. And that's just not what natural selection has the ability to do. So they're two very, very different things.
This confusion over Darwin's concept of natural selection, because when we align that with evolution, we're aligning this natural selection term with Charles Darwin too. You would have looked into this fairly substantially. How do you think of the confusion over what Darwin was saying Was he just observing things that were happening naturally, or was he using the natural selection argument to argue something that was far away from what we understand as Christian believers?
Well, when he visited the Galapagos Islands, what he was observing in some ways was the result of natural selection. For example, he saw variations in the finches. They're called Darwin's finches now because he did study them, but he saw variations in maybe their size, especially their beak sizes. But overall, they're still finches, right? They're just different species of finches. So what he did was he said, well, if those kinds of changes could occur over, a period of time, maybe if you had enough of those changes over a long period of time, he kind of extrapolated to the past and said, you give it enough time and you have enough of these changes, then maybe one kind of organism, say like a dinosaur, could eventually evolve into something like a bird, right? So you get a totally different kind of organism. But again, that's the unobservable past. And what we see with natural selection is, depending on, let's say, what kinds of seeds are available on the islands, the bird populations can vary. So a certain bird species might become more dominant finch species than another, but they're still finches, right? They're not finches becoming non-finches. They're very much staying within that. And even if you gave it a long period of time, right, millions of years, you're not going to get anything other than a finch, because there's no way to add that genetic variation or their structures and functions that are needed to go from one kind of organism into another. Like, you're going to go from dinosaurs to birds, you're going to have to add a lot of stuff, and you're going to have to take a lot of stuff away too. So we just don't see the ability within genetics to have a mechanism to add those things needed that natural selection can then select for or against.
So you can't add the genetic information that will change the kind or even the challenges within the species, but you've got the ways that those genetic mutations can actually make those animals look different. Is this the way you explain what's happening? Just the fact that you just can't add genetic information?
Right. So natural selection, that and mutations are basically the main mechanisms for Darwinian evolution. They kind of worked hand in hand. And so genetic mutations supposedly add, now they don't, but that's what evolutionists would say, is that they're going to add and make the variations that are necessary for natural selection then to select for or against to change one kind of organism into another over eons of time. That's what happened. But really, when we observe what mutations do, they detract from, they take away from, they harm, they damage typically, or maybe they don't make any significant change, sort of a neutral, quote unquote, neutral change. But there isn't much of a change at all. There isn't much of a change at all, or there's a dramatically harmful effect. Something on that scale, so to speak, but nothing that's going to add the things that you need. So, for example, I keep using dinosaurs to birds because that's a very common example today. They'll say that dinosaurs over eons of time have evolved into birds. Birds are modern day dinosaurs. But you don't have a genetic mechanism to add feathers or to even alter something that a dinosaur supposedly has, like a scale, into a feather. They're fundamentally different structures that have fundamentally different underlying genetic information. You cannot change one into the other using mutations because they're either harmful or don't have a whole lot of effect. So you just can't do it that way.
Interesting to talk about dinosaurs and feathers. I recall seeing some dinosaur exhibits some time back, and I can't even remember where it was, but there seems to be something new that's developing where anytime you see a dinosaur exhibit, they all of a sudden have feathers. Is there something in that message, or is there something that someone is trying to send a message that says there is a connection between birds and dinosaurs?
100%, yeah, because that's what they believe it happened. So now what they're doing is a lot of times they're taking these supposedly little collagen type structures that they find in the fossil record, maybe close to a dinosaur, and saying, oh, well, that's definitely a feather. That's a proto feather, or that's an early feather before it became a real feather. But a lot of times, when they look at these things and really study them more in depth, what they're finding is they're probably just remnants of collagen and things that the animals, have that make up a lot of organisms, but maybe the way that they've deteriorated and then were fossilized make them just look a little frilly, but they're not feathers. They're not like flight feathers like we see on true birds, today. So they're very, very different things, and it's just in their imagination, supposedly, that these little frilly things or whatever they might be actually became a flight feather over millions of years.
Now, Galapagos Islands, I don't know if you've had the opportunity to go there. I mean, Darwin went there and he wrote his book, Galapagos Islands, and there's all sorts of things that have come out of that particular study. Have you had the joy of actually visiting the Galapagos Islands?
Yes, I have. So back in 2011, I got to go there for a couple of weeks, and it truly was a trip of a lifetime. It was really neat to be able to see all these things that you've read about in books, especially associated with Darwin and his travels, and then to be able to see them in person. And it is amazing as you go from island to island. That's my book, Galapagos Islands, A Different View, is really looking at it from that biblical creation, biblical worldview perspective, and understanding that what you're seeing, as you go from island to island, you might see different species of finches or different species of mockingbirds or iguanas, but it's not one kind of organism becoming another. They're just well suited for the particular environment that island might have. And so they live and survive and thrive there, but they're not fundamentally changing or getting those changes that could lead them to becoming something else. They were finches in Darwin's day, they're finches in our day, and they were finches even thousands of years ago.
And there's something special about the Galapagos Islands, isn't there? If you're talking geography here again, for listeners, they might have a map in their mind. Just to the west of the north of the continent of South America, north of Ecuador. But the Galapagos Islands, they're very isolated. Was this what made it special for Charles Darwin in his studies? Because it looked as though, because they're so isolated, you've got this ecosystem that he could make a more scientific assessment about. Was that what's special about the Galapagos Islands?
Well, I think one of the things is that they're not really inhabited islands, so the animals are pretty easy to access on those islands. It's easy to get up close to them and study them, which is something kind of unique compared to most locations in the world. The other thing is he had studied organisms in Ecuador and other South American countries, and he could recognize that the animals that were on the island were similar yet different to those that were on the mainland. And so he can see this speciation that's happening. He can see variation within these kinds. And so he just thought, well, if you give it enough time and you have enough of these changes, you could get a completely different organism, which is not something he observed. Again, that's just him using his imagination. He believed in millions of years. He had already kind of established that by reading Lyell's geology books, that there were millions of years. And the fossil record is supposedly a remnant of what has occurred over all these millions of years. And so you go from very simple organisms, supposedly lower in the fossil record and the rock record, and as you go up, they supposedly get more complex. So out of that, he's kind of like, oh, okay, well, maybe this is what happened through natural selection. He didn't know anything much about genetics at that time, but through natural selection, that this could have occurred to get the organisms better suited for their environment. But again, that's all based on an idea that he had about the past, not actually based on any evidence.
Well, we're going to take a very short break and continue our conversation in just a few moments. I want to open our talkback lines. You might have your own question. You might have been bugged by all sorts of things to do with the evolutionary argument of natural selection all these years. Your opportunity today to call in. No question is off limits, no holds barred. You might have the sort of question you think, oh, this will stump that professor. Well, why don't you give us a call on 1-800-316-316. Dr. Georgia Purdom is our guest. She's a molecular geneticist, science educator, and she's the author of Galapagos Islands, A Different View. We're talking natural selection, and we're back with more in just a few moments. Our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. Our Our very special guest is Dr. Georgia Purdom. She's a molecular geneticist, science educator and author of Galapagos Islands, A Different View. She's coming to Australia. She's going to be at a conference in Brisbane at the Mueller Performing Arts Centre in just under 2 months at the end of June. So June 30th through July 1st. Guess what? It's already sold out. A 1,500-seat auditorium, and it's already sold out 2 months in advance. There's some other places that you might be able to catch Dr. Georgia Purdom, though. We'll talk about those shortly. 1-800-316-316 to join in our conversation. Georgia, this whole issue that people have with Genesis as being history, which is what we encourage Christians to aspire to understand, versus what we learned in high school, what we learned at university in science classes and under lecturers, that there is millions of years in the history. What are your thoughts on this conundrum that people have? Which side do I go on? Is it a leap of faith to say that Genesis is history? What are your thoughts when you get asked these sorts of questions?
Well, it really comes down to a worldview issue and who knows the truth about the past, who has told us the truth about the past. And that affects how we interpret the evidence that we see and what we think about that. You know, Darwin came at it from a very atheistic viewpoint and believing in millions of years and believing in what man had said about the past. And so he was trying to come up with ways that this could have worked through natural mechanisms, because that was the worldview that he started with. But when we start with God's word, and, he knows the truth about the past. He is the creator. He has given us his inerrant and infallible word so that we can know that and we can understand that. And one of the things I love about being a creation scientist is that when I look at the world and I observe it and understand it, what I see confirms what God's word says. It doesn't go against it. I think, Christians have a reasoned faith. We do not have a blind one. I think it's really evolutionists that have a blind faith in believing that all of these amazing things that we see around us, these complex organisms, can come about by random chance over eons of time. That takes a much bigger leap of faith than it does to believe what God has said in his word about how he created and that he designed all these things.
Interesting, isn't it, to talk about who has the blind faith, because the evolutionist will say, of course, it's only evolution. There is no God. Evolution is the only answer. Therefore, we have to look to all of those scientific methods of trying to confirm the millions of years. But you've got the Christian who says we don't have necessarily blind faith, because what we do is we acknowledge God. But when it comes to an issue like natural selection, which the evolutionist is blind faith about, we say, well, if we're going to be able to assess that, we need to be able to look at it and see how that works, that actually confirms the biblical view. This is the sort of thing you work on.
Right, exactly. And that's what we see over and over again, whether we're studying bacteria, we're studying finches, and I've done a lot studying microbes, the so-called simple single-celled organisms, and their ability to adapt and survive in this world. And they do an amazing job of that, and God has designed them to be master adapters and be able to do that. But that's very different from other types of organisms. We can't vary quite that much on the level that they can. But even then, even when you're talking bacteria that are designed to change and adapt, even they only do so within certain limits, because they can't just become something else. They're not on their way to becoming, even E. coli, which is, a single-celled bacterial organism. The changes that occur in it don't lead it to becoming something other than bacteria. It's still going to be within those. It's always going to be some type of E. coli or that area. It's not going to become mankind. It's not going to become mankind over millions of years, because those kind of changes just can't happen.
We're taking calls, 1-800-316-316. Let's take a call from Michael in Austral in Sydney. Hi, Michael. Welcome.
Hi, how are you both?
Good, Michael. Need to be quick. What are your thoughts?
Okay. Won't be long. Obviously, with religion and science, there's always going to be that argument. But we do need science, because the amount of cures that they come up with is immaculate. But I've always had the argument of they're trying to say that there is a missing link and that we do evolve from apes. But if that was the case, why do we still have apes today? Why haven't they evolved?
Georgia, your thoughts for Michael?
Sure. And that's a very common question, actually, that I've received. And so what we need to remember is that evolutionists believe that apes and humans share a common ancestor, but at some point in the past, they split off from that common ancestor. So this line became humans and this line became apes. And so that's why they would say we still have apes today, because again, there was a split that occurred in the past. And so you get these two separate lines that result in organisms that we have today. And so it's not a good argument to use, so to speak, because again, that's their understanding of what has happened. That's why we still have apes today. That's why we have humans today. So we just need to make sure that we're using the right kinds of arguments when we're talking against evolution.
Michael, was that a helpful response?
Thank you. Well, I think the science side of it, clinging to straws with that sort of argument, but no, I think it's either one way or another, because I'm like a born-again Christian and I'm still studying and learning, but that argument will never sit well with me. No, I don't think we ever come from apes as far as that goes.
No, and I don't think Georgia is saying we come from apes.
No, I'm not saying that. Absolutely did not come from apes. I was just saying that sometimes people say, well, if we evolved, then why are there still apes today? I thought that's what you were talking about. And so, but they would say again that we just had a common ancestor in the past, and now we're two separate, we've split off from that 6 million or 7 million years ago, and so now we have these two separate creatures today, apes and humans. That's what an evolutionist would say. I completely agree we didn't come from any kind of ape-like creature, because God created animals according to their kind, which would have included the ape kind, and then he created mankind, humankind, Adam and Eve, as the very last thing that he created.
Michael in Sydney, thank you so much for your call. 1-800-316-316 to join in our conversation. It's news time, and we're going to continue this conversation after Vision National News. So to be a part of it, you can hit us with whatever curly question you might have. 1-800-316-316. Our special guest is former biology professor Dr. Georgia Purdom, a molecular geneticist, science educator and author of Galapagos Islands, A Different View. 1-800-316-316 is our number, and you can connect too with Georgia at answersingenesis.org. Back with more after news. Good to have you with us on this Tuesday edition of 2020. And if you're just joining us, joining into a fascinating creation versus evolution conversation today, especially around what we've all come to know as natural selection. It's one of the foundations of the argument for biological evolution. Natural selection relates to the struggle for existence, survival and reproduction. Those organisms that best adapt to their environment produce more descendants in a constant competition where only the fittest survive and the weak face extinction. But our special guest today is turning the concept of natural selection on its head. She's well qualified to argue that natural selection is not evolution, but is actually supported biblically and scientifically as a God-ordained process that allows organisms to survive. Former biology professor Dr. Georgia Purdom is a molecular geneticist. She's a science educator, and she's the author of the book Galapagos Islands, A Different View. Her specialty is cellular and molecular biology. She is Vice President of Education Content and actively speaks and writes for Answers in Genesis. Dr. Purdom was designer of the Natural Selection is Not Evolution exhibit at the Creation Museum that was founded by the Australian creationist Ken Ham in the United States. Our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. You can join in our conversation no matter what your question, a evolution and creation conversation today. 1-800-316-316. Before we take another call, Georgia, let me just come back to your thoughts on species since Noah's flood, because the creation, the Genesis is history understanding of God's creation, also has this huge event, Noah's flood. And so the evidence that has come from the way that species have changed in that time. Any thoughts here of the importance of being able to identify a Noah's flood and what that actually leads us to by understanding evidence?
Yeah, I think one of the things, understanding that, that event only occurred about 4,000 years ago. And so it is really amazing to see the amount of variation and speciation that has come as a result of that event. And in some species more than others. Dogs, we know there's at least 35 species of dogs with about 300 to 400 different types of domestic dog breeds. And so God has given a lot of, obviously, genetic variation available in the dog kind. Whereas with other animals like bears, for example, we only have 8 species, and those have just arisen, since the time of the flood. And so they haven't speciated quite as much. And what's interesting about that is that, according to evolution, they would say speciation takes really, really long periods of time. It takes millions of years. And it really doesn't. We obviously have observed this speciation occurring. This is something that's happened over the last 4,000 years. We know that from starting with God's word, but also just even when we observe speciation in the present, we see that there are mechanisms in place that actually can cause that to occur quite quickly. It doesn't take millions of years. And over again, I read papers where, the scientists involved in the studies will just be like, this is happening right before our eyes. And we can't believe that because, again, they've been so indoctrinated in the idea that this speciation takes really, really long periods of time when in fact it can actually occur quickly under the right conditions. And obviously after the flood, you would have had a very different world from the one that you had before the flood. You've got lots of different environments. You've got organisms. You've got an ice age. You've got organisms, moving out from where where the ark landed. And so there was probably some quick speciation in being able to adapt and change and live in those new environments. But again, there's still some of that we can see today with, like, for example, artificial selection and dog breeding. And we see people being able to select for or against certain traits and have those different dog breeds. And so it really is amazing, I think, the variety that God has created in his organisms to allow us to be able to enjoy that and see the diversity of that.
Well, when we've got 35 species and hundreds of breeds of dogs, but you say you compare then bears, and there's only 8 species of bears. And I know you're arguing that this has happened since the floods, Noah's floods, about 4,000 years ago. That's the evidence we have today. What would be the case if there were millions of years? If you had that speciation happening at the same pace as you've seen these recent years, what would things look like if there were millions of years?
Well, a lot more species probably dead, and in the fossil record, you should see a lot, because there would be, if it would happen at the rate it's happening, or even has happened after the flood, which is probably quicker even than what we observe today, because our environments are more stable and not having as much change. But if it would happen over the long periods of time that evolution predicts, it would just take forever to even get one new species. And so it's just not plausible to even think about that. You wouldn't even see new species over. I don't know how many generations of people, right? You wouldn't even see any changes. So that's just kind of hard to believe and understand, because you think over millions of years, there's supposedly ice ages, there's catastrophes, there's other things that are happening. You would think there would be, more of these speciation events occurring and to allow organisms to survive. But it's just not, again, it doesn't work with what they have in place for evolution.
We're taking calls, 1-800-316-316. Let's take a call from Gary in Sydney. Hi, Gary, welcome.
Hello, yes. Just first like to say I'm a big fan of the program you have on YouTube.
Right.
Yeah, I was listening not long ago to a program on Answers in Genesis TV where they were talking about the Nazis and eugenics and how that sort of discrimination had formed between blacks and whites. And I was just wondering, with that argument where they say that black people were the lesser race, and I just wonder if that's a relevant argument to sort of still continue with, to say that sort of affects the way that people think today. Like, because we see between Aboriginal people and, like, say, for instance, sports people, where they get criticised saying 8 men and things like that. And I'm just wondering if that's the ideas of from Darwinism with descent of man, and is that still a good argument to have? With
Gary,
today? So
there's a lot
today.
in your question here, and it comes down to, I think, issues around race or races. Of course, we'll always say that God created one race, the human race, but there are differences in there. Georgia, what are your thoughts for Gary as he's contemplating these challenging ideas?
Yeah, so this is an area, eugenics is an area I've done quite a bit of research in, and just looking at the history of it and even how it's being carried out today. And evolutionary ideas are absolutely the foundation for eugenics, which just means well-born or good in birth. And the idea that certain humans were less evolved than other humans just because of the shade of their skin or because of the shape of their eyes or whatever it might be. And that if you know the history of it, it's really interesting because Charles Darwin's cousin was Francis Galton, and Francis Galton is considered the father of eugenics. And so they really communicated with each other a lot, and their ideas really played off of each other a lot because they believed that this could lead to, if we enacted eugenics, which in their case was, only certain people marry, only certain people reproduce, those kinds of ideas, you could lead to better and better people, and you need to keep the race pure. And, all of these ideas really came out of that evolutionary thinking. That's the foundation for that. And it's terrible ideas, terrible things that have led to persecution and racism and those kinds of ideas that have absolutely no basis in scripture, because as you said, we're all one race, the human race. Now we have different people groups or different ethnicities that came as a result of the Tower of Babel event, but we're still all one race.
Gary, I hope that was a good response to your question. 1-800-316-316. Let's take some more calls, shall we? Richard is in Alstonville in New South Wales. Hi, Richard. Welcome.
G'day, guys. I have a question. I'm not sure exactly how it fits in with the natural selection and all that when it comes to evolution. But based on time and evolution and how long they say human beings have been here and the beginning of time till the end of time. And I've heard Christian, I think it's eschatology and Christian historians put the point at somewhere between 6,250 years to 6,206 years. But evolutionists will say it's somewhere around about, is it 6 billion or something? And then humans have only been here for a period of 6 to 60 million. I'm not 100% sure.
All those times. Georgia, you've probably got the arguments of those who want to argue with you down pat. Those sorts of numbers, they're mind-boggling numbers when you get onto the evolutionary side. What are your thoughts here for Richard?
Yeah, so evolutionists would believe that the Earth itself is about 4.5 billion years old, and that humans broke off from a common ancestor with the apes about 6 million years ago. Modern humans have only been around for maybe a few 100,000 years, so we're relatively late on the scene, shall we say, in an evolutionary view. But again, all of that depends on your worldview and your starting point for knowing the truth about the past, because evolutionists would believe that radiometric dating methods give us millions and billions of years, so that must be how old the Earth is. But again, radiometric dating methods are all based on assumptions about the past, and they may or may not be correct. And so if they're wrong, it's going to give you a date that's wrong, which is going to be very problematic. And we know from Scripture itself that if you add up the genealogies and the dates there in Genesis chapter 5 and 11, as well as other places, that you get about 2,000 years between Adam and Abraham, 2,000 years between Abraham and Christ, and 2,000 years between Christ and today. So that only gives you 6,000 years. So again, it depends on your starting point and knowing for what you believe about the truth about the past.
Richard, thank you so much for your call. 1-800-316-316 to join in our conversation today. You might have a question. Let's take another call. Philip is in Albany in WA. Hello, Philip. Welcome along.
Good morning. When Jesus was entering Jerusalem, he said, if these keep quiet, the rocks will cry out. Well, I believe that the rocks are crying out, telling us exactly what has happened in the history of the world. For example, Mars has been proven to be still volcanic. Now, the law of thermodynamics says that if something is billions of years old, it would be stone cold and dead, and yet it's still erupting. Now, here on planet Earth, we've got the Pilbara jellyfish fossil. Now, that was found by Christian geologist Phil Wirtz, and he ended up in a major national debate with the evolutionists over it. Now, that the shapes in the Pilbara ironstone were not allowed to be jellyfish because they were 1 billion years out of the imagined order of when the rock was laid down and when jellyfish were supposed to have evolved. But these jellyfish had iron pyrites on the gut. Now, every geologist knows that when a creature dies in seawater and there's iron particles present, the phosphorus from the gut interacts with the iron particles and forms iron pyrites. So there is undeniable, absolute proof that, and these jellyfish are still extant. They still exist. Zero evolution, 1 billion years distant from the imagined age of planet Earth and also of the solar system.
Philip, I'm hoping that Georgia could hear everything you were saying there. There's a few little breakups along the way, but Georgia, did you catch the essence of what Philip was saying?
Yeah, it's just the idea. I mean, I'm not a geologist, but a lot of what he's talking about there are things like out of place fossils. You know, when you find things in the fossil record, you know, which aren't supposed to be there at that point because they haven't evolved yet, according to evolutionary timeframes. And when you find those, and there's lots of examples of those, and it is very challenging for evolutionists to try to explain that. And so. Again, I agree. In some ways, the rocks do cry out in that sense that they are young, they're not old, and it helps us understand. And again, that's absolutely consistent with a biblical worldview and the biblical account of creation in Genesis.
Philip, how was that for a response?
Oh, fantastic! Thank you.
1-800-316-316 to join in our conversation with our special guest. We're talking about natural selection into our conversation too, the age of the earth, a 4,000 year ago flood. We call it Noah's flood. And then bringing into that how you understand where people come up with ideas about millions or billions of years. Let me just stay with this inconsistencies in dating for a few moments, because something that Philip brought out there was that you know, you've got these. He was talking about jellyfish found in fossils, and those jellyfish are no different to the jellyfish today. So while you're talking about the speciation and the ways that that species do change, there's some that don't. Perhaps any thoughts here on the jellyfish?
Yeah, I mean, maybe not about jellyfish specifically, but it is very challenging for evolutionists when what you see a lot in the fossil record is actually stasis. In other words, things staying the same, not things really changing. I mean, how is it possible that, you know, you're finding, for example, dogs that were, 1 million years old or whatever they might be, and they're relatively the same today. You're seeing the sameness because you see this even with microbes. It's amazing, that they have a lot of the same attributes today that they did supposedly, quote unquote, millions of years ago. Well, it's because they aren't millions of years old and they haven't fundamentally changed over time. And that's what we would expect in the shorter time frame, the biblical time frame, and just again, God creating organisms according to their kinds. And while we have variation within those kinds, we don't have them becoming something other than that kind.
So the biblical Christian who's looking at the Bible in their left hand and they're looking at a science textbook in the other, and they're thinking about a younger Earth, and they're thinking about the evolutionary idea of an older Earth, thinking you can observe things happening, but it actually doesn't change the kinds of animals over time. This often gets complicated when you talk about kinds and species and breeds and those sorts of things, but kinds, this is obviously, sometimes you've got to just get to grips with that if you're going to understand your sorts of argument, I imagine. But you can observe it happening, but it doesn't change kinds over time because natural selection doesn't have the power to do that. How do you explain that?
Right. So kind usually falls, if we think about this in modern taxonomic terms, kind usually occurs at the family level. So, when we think of kingdom, phylum, class, order, and then we come to family, and then genus and species is below that. So, for example, the dog family, that's Canidae. So all of those, is pretty easy to recognize that all of those are dogs, but we have very different genus and different species within that. Same is true of cats, Felidae. You can have a lot of variation, but they're all cats. I mean, we all can see that and understand that. So we have variation within that usually, but we don't have one type of family like a cat becoming a dog or something like that. We don't have that type of change because we don't have the genetic mechanisms to make that possible.
Let's squeeze in one more call. Time's running short. Mike is in Tasmania. Hi, Mike. Welcome along.
Hi, thanks. Look, I heard that some dinosaurs' bones have been found with blood cells still in them, so they're not that old.
Georgia?
Yeah, absolutely. I've looked into that a lot too. That's sort of a favorite fossil find of mine. So we do find soft tissue in dinosaur bones, and it shouldn't be there if they're millions of years old, because organic molecules like proteins and cells, they can't last that long. And I've worked in a lab with all of those things, not necessarily dinosaur red blood cells, but, proteins and cells and things like that. And it's hard to get them to last even for short periods of time, much less for millions of years. And so it's just another evidence that is consistent with the Bible. We would expect to find things like that if those fossils have been buried quickly and deeply. And that is exactly what we find. And so, we would expect that within the thousands of years time frame, but not millions of years.
Mike in Tasmania, thank you so much for your call. Hey, time now running short. And I mentioned a little earlier, you're coming to Australia, Georgia, and one of the events that you're going to be speaking at is already sold out in a 1,500-seat auditorium at the Mueller Performing Arts Centre in Brisbane, already sold out. That one is happening on the 30th of June and 1st of July. You're also speaking at some other events, a women's conference in Sydney on July 7th and 8th. And I'm going to encourage listeners to check in with the Answers in Genesis website to get details of where you can see Georgia speaking at that women's conference in Sydney. The conference she's coming to speak at in Brisbane, she's also on the same podium with Ken Ham, the founder of Answers in Genesis and the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter. Also, Martin Isles is one of the speakers at that event, and joining them on the podium, Dr. Georgia Purdom, Molecular Geneticist. Just quickly on the Creation Museum, the Ark Encounter, you've got this really wonderful relationship and connection there. You've designed some of their educational programs. How's things going with those, Georgia? Are you get groups coming through from all over the US, in fact, all over the world?
Definitely. It's amazing to see how many buses are coming in every day, tour buses. I think tomorrow we have like 13 buses. Well, it'll be your day, but we have about 13 buses coming in, and it's amazing to see that. I think last week we had one day that had 18 buses coming, and that's just here at the museum. At the Ark, they have at least that many or more. So it really is neat to see. People ask me, when is your busy time? And I'm like, well, it's always busy. It's just a matter of busy or very busy. And so it's neat to see in our educational programs. We have camps for kids in the summer, and they're selling out, and we have labs and just all kinds of great educational programs that we offer even to guests. And a lot of times they're packed, and we have to turn people away. So it really is a neat thing to be able to see, and we're trying to expand to be able to keep up with that capacity.
Well, there's something for a bucket list for listeners who want to visit the United States to drop in and see either of or all of those particular, I'll call them attractions, but they're just amazing. The Answers in Genesis Creation Museum, the Ark Encounter. And for people to connect there and even find out where is that on the map again? We mentioned on the tri-state borders there of Kentucky in the south, Ohio in the north, and Indiana in the east of that, I think,
West.
is it? West, okay.
West.
So, answersingenesis.org, answersingenesis.org, and there's also provision there for you to be able to ask all sorts of questions about the concerns that you might have, the things that have shaped your understanding of the creation and evolution debate, and to be able to get a creationist perspective, answersingenesis.org. And Georgia Purdom, thank you so much for it's just a privilege for us to have you on, and hopefully we'll get you face to face in our studio when you're here in Australia. But wonderful to talk to you today. Thank you for sharing your heart with us today on 2020.
Yeah, thanks. I look forward to seeing you in person.